There's a question I've carried in my chest for 11 years, tucked between my ribs like a splinter you can't quite reach. Not a philosophical question, not the kind men argue about over whiskey or scripture. Just a plain, stubborn animal question. Can something broken remember the hand that chose not to walk away? I ask it because of what happened on a Tuesday in October, in a livestock auction yard outside Amarillo, Texas, with dust in my teeth and a crowd of strangers watching a donkey, gray, old, half-blind in one eye, stopped dead in its tracks and refused to move. The handlers yanked the lead rope. The animal didn't flinch. The auctioneer called out. The crowd shifted. And then the donkey turned its enormous, ruined head toward the far end of the fence line, where a man named Hector Vásquez was standing with his back to the ring, filling out paperwork he didn't even need, just trying to stay invisible. The donkey saw him, and then it did something no one in that yard could explain, something that made the auctioneer stop mid-sentence, made the handlers loosen their grip, made an entire crowd of hard-faced ranchers and traders go quiet in the way people go quiet when they've witnessed something they don't have the language for yet. I was there. I had my logbook open. I was supposed to be recording livestock movements for the regional co-op. I didn't write a single word for 6 minutes. What I did instead was watch 11 years collapse into about 40 seconds. And when it was over, I understood, or at least I started to, that some things don't heal in a straight line, that some debts don't get paid in money or gratitude, that sometimes the universe settles its accounts in the most quiet, devastating, unrepeatable ways. This is what happened, all of it, or as much of it as I can get down before the feeling fades. The year Hector Vásquez found the donkey was 2013, which was also the year he almost lost the Silo Bajo ranch, the year his wife drove to Lubbock for a cousin's wedding and didn't come back, and the year the county assessor's office sent him 4 separate notices that he ignored in sequence, each one a little more official-looking than the last, until the 4th one had the word "final" printed in red across the top like a wound. I know all of this because Hector told me later, in pieces, the way a man tells things he's never figured out how to tell whole. And I know some of it because I'd been filling out forms and inventories for the regional agricultural cooperative long enough to know that when a man's name started appearing on the assessment delinquency rolls, his whole world was usually already several seasons past saving. But that's getting ahead. The donkey came first. Hector found it on a Friday morning in early March, which in the Texas Panhandle means the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself, just settles in overnight and sits there, gray and implacable, like a bill collector waiting on the porch. He'd gone out before dawn to check the fencing on the east pasture because something had spooked the 3 horses he still kept, and the horses had been pressed against the west fence all night, which meant whatever had spooked them had come from the east. He expected a coyote, maybe a stray dog, maybe nothing at all. Horses spook sometimes for reasons that only make sense to horses. What he found instead was a donkey in the dry creek bed at the base of the eastern slope, lying on its side in the frozen mud, one leg extended at an angle that made Hector stop and look away for a moment before he looked back. The leg wasn't broken. That was the first surprise. He'd assumed it was broken from the angle. But when he got close enough, moving slow, keeping his voice low, and even the way his grandfather had taught him to approach any fallen animal, he could see the leg had been gashed badly. A long, deep tear from somewhere around the knee down to the fetlock, already crusted dark with blood that had half frozen in the night. The wound was old enough to be past the worst bleeding, but new enough to still weep at the edges when the animal moved. The donkey's eyes were open. That was the second surprise. Hector had expected something nearly gone. Instead, the animal watched him come with an expression that Hector later described to me as suspicious and exhausted in equal parts, which is maybe the most honest description of fear I've ever heard. He stood at the edge of the creek bed for a while, just breathing. The donkey watched him. He had no particular reason to do what he did next. That's important. That's the part people want to assign a motive to, a backstory, a character arc. They want there to have been something profound about his decision, some ripple of destiny or compassion or moral clarity. But Hector Vásquez has told me more than once in more than one way that the truth is simpler and stranger than that. He was cold, he was tired, his ranch was failing. His wife was probably already falling in love with someone else 300 miles away, though he didn't know that yet with any certainty. His horses were spooked. He had fences to check and forms to file, and 4 increasingly red notices from the county assessor sitting on his kitchen table. And there was a donkey in his creek bed, lying in the frozen mud, watching him with suspicious, exhausted eyes. He went back to the barn. He came back with a horse blanket, one of the old wool ones, thick and smelling of lanolin and hay, and a bucket of water, and a tin of the antibiotic paste he kept for the horses. He brought a length of fence wire, too, and a pair of pliers, because he'd learned that you could do more field work with fence wire and pliers than with half a toolbox. The donkey let him approach. That was the third surprise. Not without hesitation. Not without the ears going flat and the body stiffening and the slow, labored breath shifting into something faster and more ragged. But it let him come. Hector crouched in the mud at the animal's side and didn't touch it for a while. He just stayed there in the cold with his hands resting on his knees, not reaching for anything. He talked, because silence sometimes frightened animals more than sound. He talked about nothing in particular: the weather, the fencing, the price of hay, the shape of the clouds building in the northwest. The kind of talk that isn't about the words at all. After a while, the ears came forward. He cleaned the wound. It took a long time. The donkey flinched and trembled, and once pulled away hard enough that Hector nearly lost his grip on the leg. But it didn't kick. He packed the gash with the antibiotic paste, working it in carefully with a gloved finger, then wrapped the wound with strips from an old flannel shirt he'd shoved in his coat pocket as an afterthought. He got the blanket around the animal's barrel and rigged a loose shelter with a tarp and 2 fence posts, and a rope he tied to a mesquite root, which was a terrible shelter by any objective measure, but cut the wind enough to matter. He brought water in the bucket. The donkey drank. He went back to the barn and came back with a flake of hay, which the donkey ate with the concentrated, methodical attention of something that has decided, tentatively, to continue existing. Hector went inside and ate cold cornbread standing at the kitchen counter, and looked at the 4 notices on the table and didn't touch them. He went out again at noon. He went out again at dusk. The donkey was still there. The next 2 weeks were not easy. I want to be clear about that because the story, if you compress it the way stories get compressed, sounds like kindness followed by recovery followed by warmth, a clean arc of rescue and gratitude. It wasn't like that. The wound got worse before it got better. By the 3rd day it was showing signs of infection, hot and swollen and weeping yellow at the edges. And Hector drove 40 minutes each way to the feed store in Canyon to buy proper wound spray and a bottle of antibiotics, which cost him $67 he did not have. He put it on the cooperative's supply account, which he also didn't technically have authorization to do, and which I only found out about much later when reconciling the quarterly statements, by which point I'd decided to absorb it into miscellaneous expenses and never mention it to anyone. The donkey wouldn't stand for the first 4 days. Hector moved its water and hay to within reach. He sat with it in the evenings after the day's work was done, when he would have otherwise been sitting alone in a kitchen with 4 red notices and a silence that had started to take on specific shapes. He kept the wound clean. He changed the dressing. He talked, still about nothing in particular: the weather, the horses, a radio program he'd heard, the way the light came off the caprock at certain angles in winter, gold and thin, and somehow both desolate and beautiful at once. The donkey began to watch him differently, still wary, still tight around the eyes in the way that animals are when they've learned that the world is mostly threat. But differently, something in the quality of its attention had shifted, become more focused, more particular, the way a wild thing begins to distinguish one specific human from the general category of human, which is a category most animals have learned to distrust. On the 5th day, Hector came out at noon and found the donkey standing. It was wavering, its legs were shaking, and its weight was distributed carefully, favoring the injured leg but bearing it. But it was standing, and when Hector walked up with the water bucket, the animal didn't step back. "Bueno," Hector said, just that. He set the bucket down and let the animal drink. He named it Cobre, copper, for the red-brown tint in its gray coat that showed when the light hit it a certain way in the morning. He didn't think of it as keeping the donkey. He thought of it as getting the donkey back on its feet so it could go wherever it had come from. He told himself that. He thought it was true. By the end of the 2nd week, the wound was closing. By the end of the 3rd week, Cobre was walking. By the end of the 4th week, Cobre had figured out how to unlatch the gate to the east pasture, which Hector discovered when he came out to find all three horses clustered at the opposite end of the pasture, and Cobre standing in the middle with an expression that Hector described, accurately, I think, as unapologetic. He fixed the latch. Cobre unlatched it again 2 days later. He put a padlock on it. Cobre did not figure out the padlock. This was not, Hector told me, because Cobre wasn't smart enough. It was because Cobre decided the padlock was beneath its dignity. I didn't know about any of this yet. I knew Hector Vásquez as a name on a file, as a set of delinquent assessment notices and a shrinking inventory list. I wouldn't meet him in person for another 6 months when the cooperative sent me out to verify his livestock count, a standard process when a member's account had been flagged for irregularities. By then, the divorce had been filed. By then, the assessor had agreed to a repayment plan that would take Hector most of a decade to fulfill. By then, the 3 horses had been sold, 2 to a neighboring ranch, 1 to a family in Lubbock who wanted a trail horse for their kids to cover the most pressing debts. The ranch had contracted to its minimum viable core. Hector, 47 acres of panhandle scrub and caliche, a barn in need of roof repair, some chickens, and Cobre. I drove out in July. The heat was what it always is in July in the panhandle, which is to say it was the kind of heat that makes you understand why certain ancient peoples concluded that the sun was an angry deity. Hector met me at the gate. He was lean and sun-darkened, and had the hands of a man who did most of his work alone, rough and permanently stained at the knuckles with the particular grime that comes from working with machinery and animals and doesn't fully wash out anymore. He shook my hand, looked at my logbook with the quiet wariness that people develop toward anyone who comes to their property with official paperwork, and invited me in for water. I noted the livestock count, 1 donkey gray male approximately. I asked Hector about the age. He shrugged. The vet said between 8 and 12, she guessed closer to 10. I wrote approx, 10 years in the logbook. I noted the condition, good, well-maintained, obvious care. I noted the scar on the left rear leg, visible even from a distance, a long pale seam through the darker hide. How long have you had him? I asked. About 4 months, Hector said. He was a rescue. I noted it and moved on. It was not at that point a significant entry. I finished the verification. I shook his hand again. I drove back toward Canyon with the windows down, because the air conditioning in the cooperative's truck had given up sometime around Memorial Day. I almost didn't look back. But I did, just a glance in the rearview mirror as I hit the main road, and I saw Hector Vásquez standing at the fence of the east pasture with his forearms resting on the top rail, and beside him, close enough that their shoulders, his and Cobre's, were almost touching, the gray donkey standing perfectly still, both of them looking out at the same piece of scrubland in the same direction at nothing in particular. I kept driving. I didn't know yet what I'd seen. Over the next several years, Hector Vásquez became a name I encountered regularly in the cooperative's files, not for dramatic reasons but for steady, grinding ones. The repayment plan, the slow rebuilding, a season where the crops came in short, a season where they came in better, an equipment loan carefully managed, a small government conservation grant he applied for, which I helped him navigate because the forms were Byzantine, and I had a particular grudge against Byzantine forms. He came into the cooperative office occasionally, always early, always with the paperwork already filled out and organized, always with the quality of concentration of a man who has decided not to be careless about anything he can control. We talked about ranch business. Occasionally we talked about other things, the weather, local news, a mutual acquaintance who'd retired. He mentioned Cobre sometimes, the way you mention someone who is simply part of your life, not as a story but as a presence. Cobre ate the baling twine again. Cobre figured out how to open the feed bin. Cobre somehow got into the truck cab, and I don't know how, and I'm choosing not to think about it too hard. I laughed at these the way you laugh at accounts of someone you've never met, but feel you know through the consistent, particular affection of the person telling them. Cobre got older, Hector got older. The ranch survived, which in the Texas panhandle over that decade was something like a minor miracle. He didn't get rich. He didn't have a dramatic reversal. He just kept at it, the way certain people keep at things, not out of hope exactly, but out of a stubbornness so deep it's indistinguishable from faith. I kept my logbook. I noted dates and inventory counts and transaction records. I developed over the years the habit of writing small marginal notes, not official observations, just impressions, the kind of thing you put down because you're a person and not a ledger, and sometimes things happen that are worth noting outside the columns. In the margin of Hector's file, dated October 2017, I wrote, "Man is doing better. Think the donkey helps." I don't know what possessed me to write that. It wasn't the kind of thing the cooperative wanted in its files, but I left it. The thing about Cobre, the thing I pieced together over those years of periodic visits and second-hand accounts, was that the donkey had an exceptional memory. Not in a remarkable animal story way, not in the way people talk about elephant memory as a kind of myth or metaphor. Just factually, concretely, practically, Cobre remembered things. Hector had noticed it first in small ways. The donkey never forgot a routine, never had to relearn a gate or a water source or the sound of a particular truck's engine. But more than that, Cobre remembered people. A farrier who'd been rough with him once, pressing too hard when trimming the scarred rear hoof, was never again approached willingly, even years later when the man came out for a different animal. Not aggressive, just a flat, impassive refusal, ears back, body turned away. A wall of equine disinterest so complete and consistent it felt like a verdict. A veterinarian who'd been careful and deliberate, and had taken the extra time to let Cobre smell her equipment before using it was greeted, at each subsequent visit, with what the vet herself called alarming levels of enthusiasm for a large gray donkey. And Hector, who had come down the frozen creek bed on a March morning with a horse blanket and a tin of antibiotic paste, and his voice talking about nothing in particular. Hector was remembered in the way that I think very few people are remembered by anything, human or animal, not with performance or display. With a consistency so quiet and total that it just became the background of the place. Wherever Hector was, Cobre angled toward. Whatever Hector was doing, Cobre orbited, not dependently, not anxiously, just present, in the way that something is present when it has decided, somewhere below language and reasoning, that this is where it belongs. I noted it on my visits, in my unofficial margins. Small things. The donkey tracking Hector's movement across the yard without appearing to. The way Cobre's ears would orient before Hector had fully come into view, catching some sound or scent with an efficiency that preceded any visual cue. The way the animal would stand close to him, not for warmth, not for food, not for any obvious practical reason. Just close, in that almost touching way I'd first seen in the rearview mirror on a July afternoon years before. I wrote, "The donkey knows where he is, always." And then the letter came. It came in February of 2024, 11 years after Hector had found Cobre in the frozen creek bed. It came from the county assessor's office, and it wasn't a notice of delinquency this time. It was a notice of property tax reassessment. The county had rezoned a corridor of the Panhandle that included Hector's 47 acres, rezoned it for potential commercial and industrial development, which meant the assessed value of his land had increased, which meant his property tax burden had more than tripled, which meant the repayment plan he'd spent 11 years faithfully executing was suddenly, catastrophically irrelevant. He had 60 days to respond. He came into the cooperative office on a Wednesday morning before it officially opened and sat in the chair across from my desk with the letter folded in his hands, and I understood immediately from his face that something had shifted. Not broken. Hector's face wasn't the kind that broke easily. But shifted, some quality of set had moved, like a load-bearing element under too much weight that hasn't failed yet but has changed its angle. He put the letter on my desk. I read it. I looked at the numbers and then looked out the window for a moment at the February sky, which was doing nothing dramatic. Just gray and even, the same sky it had been for most of the decade. And then I looked back at the letter. 60 days, he said. Yes. Can I fight it? You can appeal the assessment. It takes. I stopped. I knew what it took. Time and money and legal expertise and a favorable hearing and a set of conditions that were not reliably available to a man who had spent 11 years pulling himself back to barely enough. You can appeal it, I said. I'll help you with the forms. He nodded once. He took the letter back and folded it again along the same crease. What about Cobre? He asked. It wasn't a non sequitur. I understood immediately what he meant. If the ranch went, if it came to a sale or a forced transfer, then Cobre went too. A 14-year-old donkey, one-eyed now, with a scarred rear leg and an opinion about most people, and a total, abiding orientation toward one man on earth, entered the market as an aging working animal with no particular commercial value. I didn't say anything immediately. He looked at me. "He's old," Hector said. "I don't know how old. The vet said maybe 17, 18 now, older than she thought when I first brought him in." "He's healthy." Hector paused. "He's himself. He does what he does, he moves slower. The eye went last spring, just went, the vet said it happens. But he stopped again. "He's fine, he's good." He said he's good the way you say something true that you're also protecting, that you're keeping in a certain frame so it doesn't become something else. I filed the appeal paperwork with him that afternoon. I made the copies, filed the forms, wrote the accompanying letter in the careful, formal language that official correspondence requires, which I've always found to be a kind of translation, turning a man's life and desperation into language that a committee can evaluate without having to feel it directly. I noted in my personal log that evening, not in any official record, 60 days, going to be close. Don't know if the ranch survives this one. I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote one more line. Cobre is 17 or 18 now. Still good, Hector says. I closed the log. I didn't sleep especially well. The 60 days moved the way time moves when you're waiting on something you can't control. Not fast, not slow, but with a particular texture, like cloth pulled across a rough edge. Every day smooth for most of its length, and then a small, catching resistance at the end that reminded you what you were moving toward. I saw Hector twice during those weeks. Once when he came in to drop off supplementary documentation for the appeal, land surveys, a decade of tax payment records, a statement from a neighbor regarding the agricultural character of the property. The second time was accidental. I was at the feed store in Canyon picking up a supply order for the cooperative, and he was there buying hay, and we stood in the parking lot for a few minutes in the cold, not saying much, both of us aware that there was nothing useful left to say about the appeal process that hadn't already been said. He looked tired in a specific way, not physically tired, not the tiredness of insufficient sleep, but the tiredness of sustained vigilance, of keeping yourself squared up toward a problem that hasn't resolved. The kind of tired that settles in the jaw and the space between the eyes. "How's Cobre?" I asked, because it was a question with an answer that didn't depend on appeals or assessors or 60-day windows. Something in his face eased a fraction. "Just a fraction. He got into the chicken coop yesterday," Hector said. "I don't know why, the chickens were not pleased." I laughed. "What did you do?" "Told the chickens they were overreacting." He paused. "I told Cobre the same thing. Neither of them listened." I drove back to the office with that image, Hector mediating between an elderly one-eyed donkey and a coop full of offended chickens, and wrote it in my log, not because it was relevant to anything official, just because it deserved to exist somewhere. The appeal hearing was scheduled for the 9th week, which meant it technically exceeded the 60-day window. Hector's lawyer, a young woman named Marissa Caballero, who worked out of Amarillo and had a reputation for being unreasonably tenacious about agricultural property cases, had bought the extension on a technicality related to the original notice's delivery date, which bought them 3 extra weeks that she used efficiently. I drove to Amarillo for the hearing. I wasn't required to be there. The cooperative had no formal standing in the case. But I'd been involved in the filing process, and Hector had asked me, indirectly and carefully, if I might be willing to provide context about the agricultural and financial history if it was needed. And I'd said yes. And so I sat in the back of the county administrative hearing room with my logbook on my knee and watched Marissa Caballero take apart the reassessment with the calm, meticulous efficiency of someone who has done this specific kind of demolition many times before. She was good, I'll say that. She laid out the agricultural use documentation, the decade-long compliance record, the specific language of the zoning overlay and its applicability, or rather, its non-applicability, to a working ranch of Hector's acreage and configuration. She cited 3 precedents in adjacent counties. She was quiet and precise, and gave the panel absolutely nothing to grab onto that wasn't either a fact or a statute. Hector sat at the table and answered questions when asked, which wasn't often. He'd worn a clean shirt and his good boots. He held his hat in his hands the whole time, which I knew was a habit. He held things when he was managing himself, giving his hands something to do so the rest of him could stay still. The panel deliberated for 20 minutes. They ruled in his favor. Partial relief. The assessment was reduced, not eliminated, but reduced to something closer to the previous figure, and structured in a way that Marissa quietly explained to Hector was manageable, if not comfortable. Hector nodded once. He put his hat on. He shook Marissa's hand, and then he shook mine. Go home, I told him. Tell Cobre. He almost smiled. It was close. It was close enough. I need to tell you about the accident, because the story doesn't make sense without it, and I've been arranging the pieces in the order that felt truest, which isn't always the chronological order. 3 months after the hearing, in January of 2025, Hector fell. Not a dramatic fall, not the kind of fall that announces itself. He was repairing the barn roof in the early morning, which he'd been putting off for 2 seasons because of the expense, and the section of decking he was standing on had rotted through further than it appeared from below, and he went through it. He fell about 12 feet onto the barn floor. He broke 3 ribs, his left wrist, and suffered a concussion that the hospital in Amarillo kept him for 4 days to monitor. The wrist required surgery, a plate and several screws, an operation that was straightforward as these things go, but left him with a hand that would work again in time but would not, the surgeon was careful to explain, work entirely the way it had before. The ribs healed. The concussion resolved without lasting effect, which was the best possible outcome of what could have been much worse. The wrist was something else. It was his left hand, and Hector was right-handed, which the surgeon mentioned as a fortunate circumstance. What the surgeon did not mention, because it was not medically relevant but was very practically relevant, was that Hector ran a 47-acre ranch alone, and doing that with a post-surgical wrist in January was like trying to navigate a ship with one broken rudder during a storm. You could do it. You could survive it. But there was a cost. I found out about the fall the way I found out about most things in Hector's life, through the cooperative files, which flagged an absence from a scheduled equipment maintenance check, which I followed up on with a phone call that went to voicemail, which was followed eventually by a return call from a woman named Dolers who was Hector's sister-in-law, calling from his phone to let the cooperative know he'd be temporarily unavailable. I drove out the next morning. The ranch looked managed, but barely, the way something looks when a capable person has been attending to it through physical pain, covering the essentials and letting the rest wait. The barn roof had been tarped. The yard was quiet in the January way, nothing moving, the chickens shut up against the cold. Cobre was at the east fence. The donkey was standing very still, facing the direction of the house, in the particular posture of watchful waiting that I'd come to recognize over years of visits. But there was something different in it this time, an intensity that was its own kind of information. I'd seen Cobre in this posture before, but it had usually resolved quickly, reorienting when Hector appeared. This posture wasn't resolving. It was sustained, concentrated, like a question being held open. Hector came to the door when I knocked. His left arm was in a brace and sling. He looked like he'd slept poorly and recently made peace with that. "You didn't have to come out," he said. "I know," I said. "Can I make coffee?" He let me in. We sat at the kitchen table, which had no notices on it anymore, just a stack of medical paperwork and a half-finished crossword, and a coffee mug that had been there long enough to leave a ring. And I made coffee and didn't say anything about the accident beyond asking practical questions about his recovery timeline and what he needed. He needed help is what he needed. He was not good at asking for it. This was something I'd understood about him for a long time, and it wasn't a flaw exactly. It was the same quality that had kept the ranch alive through a decade of structural difficulty. The same stubbornness that had knelt in frozen mud with a horse blanket and an antibiotic tin, and chosen not to walk away from an injured animal that had nothing to offer him. You couldn't separate the persistence from the inability to ask. They were the same thing, looking in different directions. "I'm going to contact the cooperative's volunteer network," I told him. "They have a working ranch assistance program for emergencies. You qualify." He looked at me. "I'm not." "You qualify," I said again. "Let me make the call." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the kitchen window, I could see the east fence. Cobre was still there. "He's been like that since I got home from the hospital," Hector said, following my gaze. Standing at that fence. Usually he moves around, he's not moving around. He can smell the injury, I said. Hector looked at me. The vet said the same thing. She said animals can smell changes in body chemistry, pain, illness. He knows something's wrong. Hector was quiet again. He looked at his hand in the brace. He keeps trying to get through the fence, he said. He's not trying to get out, he's just pressing against it, like he wants to be closer. I looked at the donkey at the fence. The donkey's head was up, ears forward, the one working eye directed at the house with the focused, total attention of something that has organized its entire sensory apparatus around a single point of concern. He remembers, I said. I wasn't entirely sure what I meant by that when I said it. Hector understood, though, or at least he understood it his own way, which was probably more accurate than mine. He remembers the creek bed, he said. The cold, the mud being down. He paused. He knows what it means when the person who fixed that is the one who's... He stopped. He doesn't like it, he said finally. He doesn't like me being hurt. We drank the coffee. The volunteer network came through. 2 ranch hands from the neighboring county who spent the better part of 3 weeks covering the essential work. Feeding, fence checking, keeping things intact, while Hector's wrist began the long, grinding process of healing. During those weeks, Cobre remained unusually close to the house. Not in the frantic, distressed way of an animal in crisis, but in the quiet, deliberate way of something maintaining vigil. The ranch hands noted it. One of them, a younger man named Garrett who'd grown up with horses and mules, told me later that he'd never seen a donkey behave quite that way. Like he appointed himself, Garrett said. Like he decided it was his job to stay within eyeshot. I wrote that down, appointed himself, his job. I filed the volunteer assistance paperwork, noted the medical leave dates, updated the cooperative records. In the margin, I wrote, Cobre is keeping watch. Spring came. The wrist healed to the point where Hector could work again, carefully, with modifications. The barn roof got properly repaired in April. Garrett came back with a friend to do it, neither of them charging anything beyond materials, which was the panhandle way of doing things that I'd always respected without quite understanding, until I'd spent enough years watching it operate. Cobre returned to his normal patterns, the east fence, the chicken coop vicinity, the feed bin he'd long since figured out and now merely chose not to exploit as far as anyone could tell. The deliberate, unhurried movement of a large, elderly animal who has concluded that urgency is mostly unnecessary. His eye, the blind one, was fully gone now, covered in a pale, permanent opacity. The vet said he'd adapted completely, as animals usually do, adjusting his head position slightly to angle the working eye toward whatever he was most interested in. It gave him an expression that people who didn't know him read as skeptical. People who did know him read it as simply Cobre. I went out twice that spring for routine checks. On the second visit, in late May, I sat with Hector on the porch for a while after we'd finished the official inventory, because the evening was doing what panhandle evenings sometimes do in late May, settling into something almost unbearably beautiful, the light going long and gold across the scrubland, the air cooling just enough to be kind. Cobre came around the corner of the barn and stood in the yard, about 20 feet from the porch. He was watching Hector. Not me he registered and dismissed in the same movement, a brief angling of the working eye and then a return to the more important subject. He was watching Hector the way he always watched Hector, with that total, particular, accumulated attention. 17 years, I said, at least. Hector looked at me. That's how long the vet thinks he is now. You said 18 last winter, he might be older. Hector looked at Cobre. Old, he said. Old, I agreed. How long do donkeys live? 30 years if they're lucky, some longer. He paused. She said he's healthy for his age, good weight, good teeth, well, most of his teeth, heart sounds good. So he's got time. He's got time, Hector said. He said it the way you say something you're allowing yourself to believe carefully without leaning on it too hard. We sat with that for a while. The light went lower. Cobre didn't move from the yard. When I was in the hospital, Hector said, the first night I couldn't sleep, which they told me was normal with a concussion. You just stay awake, and everything feels very particular. Clear in a strange way. He paused. I kept thinking about that morning, the creek bed. I don't know why, that was 12 years ago. What did you think about it? I thought, he stopped. Looked at his hands, the left one still slightly different in its configuration, a new crookedness at the wrist that surgery had corrected to functional but not quite to original. I thought at the time that I was doing it because there was nothing else to do, because walking away was a choice too, and I didn't want to make that choice. He was quiet. But I don't think that's actually why. Why then? He looked at Cobre. Cobre's working eye was on him, steady and patient. Because he was there, Hector said. In the mud, hurt, and the question was just, he shook his head slightly. Whether I was going to be the person who stopped or the person who kept walking. That's all it was. That's all it ever is. I didn't say anything. The light finished its business with the scrubland and moved on. I need to tell you about the sale, and what almost happened, because without that, the October morning in Amarillo doesn't carry its full weight. In August of 2025, a year and a half after the property tax appeal, 7 months after the fall from the barn roof, Hector received an offer on the ranch. It came from a land aggregation company that had been buying up panhandle properties for the past several years, assembling them into parcels for what the paperwork described as agricultural investment purposes, and what most people in the county understood to mean eventual commercial development or wind energy leasing or some combination of both. They'd bought the Trevor's place. They'd bought the old Gallegos operation. They'd approached the Menaches and been refused. They approached Hector in August, and the number they offered was not insulting. It was, in fact, high enough to constitute a genuine argument, high enough to retire the remaining debt, put money away, move somewhere with weather that didn't require a person to fight for everything 11 months out of 12. He brought the offer to the cooperative office. Not for advice, exactly. He'd already consulted Marissa Caballero, but for something else. To have someone look at it who had been looking at his situation for a decade and could give him a read that wasn't purely legal or financial. I read it carefully. I did the math on the remaining debt. I looked at the numbers. It's enough, I said. Yes. What does Marissa say? She says take it or don't. She laid out both scenarios. He paused. She's not sentimental about land, which is useful. What does it mean for Cobre? He had been waiting for that question. I could tell by the way the stillness changed in him when I asked it. Not surprise, something prepared for and still difficult. The offer includes all structures and any remaining livestock, he said. Standard language, which means, he stopped. You could negotiate that out, I said. Marissa asked. They said no, they want a clean transfer. He looked at the window. He's 17, maybe 18, he's old, he's adjusting. But there aren't many operations that take in an elderly donkey with one eye and a temperament. The county rescue would list him. He might be fine. He might be fine. I wrote that in my log that evening, and then stared at it for a long time. He might be fine, and it might be true, and Hector knew it better than I did, and still the 3 words sat there like a door that hadn't quite closed. He didn't sell. He told me 3 weeks later, when he stopped by the office to drop off a form. He said it simply without explanation, and I didn't ask for one. I just noted it in the file. In the margin I wrote, didn't sell, his call. And then below that, in smaller writing that I didn't entirely intend as an official notation, I think I know why. The auction at Amarillo came about through a different route, which I'll explain because context matters here and the coincidence of it. If coincidence is the right word, which I'm less sure about than I used to be, is part of what I've been sitting with ever since. The auction was a quarterly livestock and equipment sale that the regional cooperative organized in conjunction with 2 other ag organizations. I was there in my official capacity, coordinating the cooperative's consignment entries, managing the administrative side of the cataloging. It was routine. It was a Tuesday in October, and I had my logbook and a paper coffee cup and 2 pages of consignment numbers to verify. Hector was there because, and this is where the coincidence starts to feel like something else, one of his neighbors, a man named Pickett who ran a small Angus operation about 6 miles east of Hector's place, had asked Hector to come along and help him with some equipment he was selling. Pickett was in his 70s and had bad knees and needed someone to handle the physical part of moving the machinery through the yard. So Hector was there doing Pickett a favor, filling out paperwork at the entry table, keeping himself out of the way of the main activity, which was what he'd have done in any case, because Hector Vásquez was constitutionally inclined to the edge of any room. Cobre was there because of the rescue intake. That requires explanation, too. The County Animal Rescue Organization, with which the cooperative had a formal relationship, had a standing arrangement to bring eligible livestock to the quarterly auction for exposure. Most of the animals were horses and cattle. Occasionally, there were other animals. In this case, the rescue had received 2 donkeys over the summer, one young, one older, and had decided to use the October sale as an opportunity to find them permanent placements, since the organization's facility was operating above capacity. The older donkey had been surrendered by an estate in late July when the owner died, and the heirs had no interest in the property or its animals. He was 18 years old, the intake form estimated, gray with a scarred rear left leg, one functioning eye. I didn't know this. I hadn't processed the rescue organization's consignment. A colleague had handled that side of the paperwork. I was at the far end of the consignment table, working through Pickett's equipment entries, when I heard the commotion from the livestock ring. Not a dramatic commotion, no noise, no shouting. A commotion of absence, of something stopping. The particular hush that moves through a crowd when something unexpected happens, the way a wave moves through still water, the disturbance reaching the edges before you even understand the center. I looked up. The handlers had brought a gray donkey into the ring. The auctioneer was at the start of his patter, lot number, approximate age, condition, when the animal stopped. Not spooked, not resisting in the way of an anxious animal. Just stopped. Planted its 4 feet in the ring dirt and became immovable in the particular way that donkeys, uniquely among large animals, can become immovable, as if they have simply decided that the concept of forward motion no longer applies to them. The handlers worked the lead rope. The donkey didn't move. The auctioneer paused. The crowd, which had been the usual low-level noise of a livestock auction, shuffling, murmuring, phones, paper, went quiet. And the donkey raised its head. It moved its head in the slow, deliberate way of a partially sighted animal compensating for reduced field of vision, angling the working eye through a particular arc. Not frantically, not urgently, methodically, the way you search for something when you're fairly sure it's there but need the angle to be right. I followed the animal's gaze. Hector was at the far end of the fence line. His back was to the ring. He was filling out paperwork at the consignment table, head down, pen moving. The donkey held its angle. I watched Hector's pen stop. I watched his posture change, the particular change of a body that has registered something before the mind has caught up, a message in the peripheral nervous system that hasn't reached the language centers yet. He turned slowly, the way you turn when some part of you knows what's there and is managing the knowing carefully, keeping it at arm's length until you can be sure. He turned and he saw the gray donkey in the ring, standing still in the ring dirt with its working eye fixed on the fence line, fixed on him, and the scar on the rear left leg visible even from that distance, the long pale seam through the darker hide. The auctioneer's voice had stopped completely. Cobre made a sound. Not a bray, not the loud, carrying sound donkeys are known for, the sound that commands attention over distance. Something quieter, something I'd never heard a donkey make before, which I know is inadequate description, but I'm a logbook person and not a poet, and I'm doing my best. A low, continuous vocalization that was neither distress nor greeting exactly, but something between them, something that seemed to be both a question and its own answer. Hector's face, I was watching his face, I couldn't not, did something I don't have clean language for. It moved through several things in quick succession, the way a landscape moves through light when clouds are passing fast. Something that was recognition, something that was grief. Something that was, not joy exactly, but joy's structural neighbor, the thing that sits next to joy and is sometimes confused for it. Relief. The relief of something found, specifically of something you didn't know you were still looking for. He didn't move for a moment. The crowd didn't move. The handlers had both released the lead rope, which was unusual. Professional handlers don't typically release a lead rope in a ring. But they'd released it instinctively and were standing with their hands open. Then Hector walked to the fence. He didn't run, he didn't call out. He walked across the yard to the fence of the ring in that unhurried, measured way of his. The way he did everything. And he put his hands on the top rail and leaned there, forearms resting on the wood, and looked across the ring at the donkey who was already oriented toward him, already angled. that working eye already locked. Cobre walked to the fence. Not slowly, this part wasn't slow. The donkey covered the ring in the brisk, deliberate movement of something that has already made its decision and is simply executing it, and came to the fence where Hector was and put its face against Hector's chest. Not the chest, the forearms actually, the forearms that were resting on the rail, the same way they'd been resting on the east pasture fence at Silo Bajo for years. Cobre lowered its head and pressed its forehead against Hector's forearms and stayed there. Hector didn't say anything. He put one hand on the donkey's poll, the spot between the ears at the top of the head, the place that animals allow when they trust, and held it there. I stopped writing at that point. I don't know exactly when I stopped. I just looked at the logbook later and there was a gap in the entries, a white space where the next auction lot number should have been, and then the entries resumed on the following line as if the gap were nothing, as if you could just skip over it and carry on. I looked around at the crowd. Hard-faced ranchers, livestock traders, a woman from the county extension office I recognized, two teenagers who'd come with their father. Garrett, the ranch hand who'd helped after Hector's fall, standing with his arms crossed and his chin down. Nobody was saying anything. One of the handlers, a man in his 50s who'd been doing livestock work his entire adult life, was looking at the fence with an expression that I can only describe as careful. The careful expression of someone managing something they don't want to lose by looking at it too directly. I went around to the consignment entry table and found my colleague who'd processed the rescue organization's intake. "The gray donkey," I said. "In the ring lot," I checked my sheet. "Lot 43, the older one." She looked up. "What about him? Where was he before the rescue intake?" She pulled up the file on her tablet. "Surrendered by an estate. Owner passed away in," she scrolled, "late July. Property in." She named a town I didn't immediately recognize 1 county over. "Estate heirs didn't want the animal, surrendered him through the estate executor." "Before that, do they have any history?" "Intake form says," she scrolled more. "Owner stated animal had been in his care for approximately 10 years. Previously found as a stray approximately 2014. She paused. "There's a note from the rescue. They said the scar on the rear leg was an old injury, healed but significant. Intake vet estimated original injury was at least 10 years prior." I looked at the ring. Hector and Cobre were still at the fence. The auctioneer had made no attempt to restart. The handlers were standing to the side. The crowd had begun to talk again, but quietly, in the way people talk when they're telling each other what they've just seen, trying to make it hold still in words. I did the arithmetic. Cobre and Hector's creek bed, March 2013. Cobre surrendered to rescue, July 2025. In the care of a second owner for approximately 10 years, meaning he'd come to that owner around 2015. Meaning he'd come to that owner roughly 2 years after Hector had found him in the frozen creek bed. 2 years, Hector had held on to the ranch through 2013, 2014, 2015. He'd held on to Cobre through all of that. And then, something. I'd have to look back at the files at what I might have missed or not seen clearly. But something at some point in 2015 must have come apart. Not the ranch. The ranch had survived barely year by year. But something. Some juncture that I hadn't been present for, hadn't known to record. I went back to the ring. I went up to Hector, who was still at the fence, Cobre's head still against his forearms, and I stood beside him and didn't say anything for a moment. "You knew him before," I said. It wasn't a question. Hector didn't look at me. He was looking at the donkey. "Yes," he said. "What happened?" He was quiet for a long moment. The crowd had thinned now, some people drifting to other areas of the yard, some still watching from a distance. The specific distance people keep when they're trying to observe something without intruding on it. 2015, Hector said. "The drought was bad that year, you remember." I remembered. "I couldn't afford the feed. I couldn't afford the well repair. I couldn't." He stopped. "I couldn't keep him. I had 2 horses left and I let one go that spring and I thought I could keep Cobre, but then the well went in June and I did the math and He stopped again. He wasn't having trouble speaking exactly. He was having trouble deciding how much to give to the heir. I found him a placement, a man I knew slightly from church. He had land and he had feed and he said he'd take good care of him. I drove Cobre there myself. I tried to reconstruct my records from that year. I would have been tracking Hector's account through the drought. The 2015 entries would be there, the equipment loan modification, the livestock count that had shrunk from 3 horses and a donkey to 1 horse and nothing. 1 horse and nothing. I'd noted it in the file and thought the donkey had been sold, and moved on to the next line. "You never told me," I said. "You didn't ask." He said it without accusation. He was right, I hadn't asked. It hadn't been in my forms. And he paused. It wasn't something I wanted to explain. I thought he was fine. The man promised he'd be fine. And then the man had a stroke 2 years ago and his family. He shook his head. They called the estate executor, and the executor called the rescue, and Cobre ended up in the intake system, and I didn't know. I didn't know until right now. The donkey's head was still against his forearms, still pressed there with a stillness that wasn't passivity. It was something deliberate, maintained, a choice that the animal was continuously making. "He remembered you," I said, "from across the yard." "I know. From 12 years ago. 2 years with you and then 10 years somewhere else and then 6 months in rescue intake and—" I stopped. I didn't know how to finish that sentence in a way that was adequate to what I was looking at. "Animals remember," Hector said. "More than we give them credit for. They remember differently. Not the way we remember, not in words and stories, but they remember." He was quiet. "He knows I'm the person who came down in the mud. He's known that since the first week. He never forgot it." I looked at Cobre. The donkey's working eye was half closed now, in the particular expression of large animals in a state of, I don't know what to call it. Not calm exactly. Something more active than calm, something that looked like arriving. "Buy him," I said. Hector finally looked at me. "I know. The auction system, the rescue organization prices are set. Not market, he won't be expensive." "I know. You can afford it." "I know," he said, for the 3rd time, quietly. Then, "I always knew I'd fix it if I could." The paperwork took 40 minutes. The purchase was formally recorded. I handled the cooperative side of the transfer documentation, which gave me an excuse to be involved, and which I executed with more careful attention to detail than the situation probably required, because I am a logbook person, and this was a record I wanted correct. Lot 43. 1 donkey gray male, age estimated approximately 18 years. Scarred rear left leg, right eye non-functional. Transferred to owner, Hector Vásquez, Silo Bajo Ranch. In the notes field, which no one would read and which I filled out anyway, previously in this owner's care, 2013-2015. Reunited at auction, October 2026. Both parties confirmed recognition. Animal visibly responsive to owner. I drove home that afternoon through the Panhandle scrub, through the October light that was doing what it does in October out here. Going gold and long and particular. The same light I'd watched from Hector's porch that evening years ago. The same light that seems to know something about lasting and loss, and the way certain things come back around. I had my logbook on the passenger seat. At the first stop sign I reached, I opened it to a fresh page. I sat there for a moment with my pen over the paper. Then I wrote the date, and the location, and the lot number, and the transfer record. All of it precise, all of it documented. And then I sat for another moment. And then, below the official record in the margin, in the writing that's mine and not the cooperative's and not anyone's but mine, I wrote this. 12 years, different owners, different county, 6 months in a rescue facility, and the donkey still new. Turned its head across a crowded auction yard, and found the one person who had ever come down into the mud. I have been keeping records for 19 years. I have logged livestock counts and equipment transfers and delinquency notices and drought losses and recovery plans and every manner of agricultural fact and figure. I don't know what to log this as. I think I'll just log it as true. I stopped by Silo Bajo 3 weeks later. End of October, the light already going shorter, the cold starting to remember itself. Hector had said the reintegration had gone fine. Cobre had walked around the yard for an hour when he arrived, inspecting it in the methodical way of an animal taking inventory, and then had gone to the east fence and stood there looking out, and then had come back and done the whole thing again, and by the 2nd day was operating as if he'd never left. He was at the east fence when I pulled in, standing in his usual posture facing east, ears forward. He angled his working eye toward the sound of the truck, registered it, dismissed it. He went back to looking east. I found Hector in the barn, repairing a section of stall divider with the careful, modified technique he developed for working with the post-surgical wrist. He heard me come in and looked up. "How's he settling?" I asked. "Like he never left," Hector said. We walked out to the yard. Cobre heard the footsteps and angled his working eye over his shoulder, and then, not quickly, not dramatically, turned from the east fence and walked toward us. He came to Hector, put his face against Hector's chest this time, properly, forehead and muzzle both, pressing in with the patient, warm weight of something that has arrived and knows it. Hector put his hand on the pole. Neither of them said or did anything else. I stood at the edge of it, close enough to witness, far enough not to be inside it. I had my logbook in my coat pocket, but I didn't take it out. I just stood there. The light came off the scrubland the way it always does in October out here, gold and long and thin, and the donkey stood with his forehead against the man's chest, and the man stood with his hand between the gray ears, and it was quiet the way the panhandle is quiet when the wind stops, completely, specifically, without apology. I thought about what Hector had said at the fence, whether I was going to be the person who stopped or the person who kept walking. I thought about the creek bed in March, the frozen mud, the horse blanket. I thought about the 4 red notices on the kitchen table. I thought about a drought year and a difficult calculation and a truck driving a donkey to someone else's land and a stroke and an estate executor and 6 months in a rescue intake. I thought about a gray donkey raising its head in an auction ring and searching through the crowd with its one working eye, methodically, without urgency, the way you search for something when you're fairly sure it's there but need the angle to be right. I thought about memory, not the human kind, not the kind I practice in logbooks, but the other kind. The kind that lives somewhere below words and doesn't need a date written next to it to stay true. The kind that holds on to the particular hand, the particular voice, the particular presence of the one person who chose to stop. The kind that apparently survives 10 years and different counties and a rescue facility and 6 months of uncertainty. I thought about the question I've been carrying in my chest since October. Can something broken remember the hand that chose not to walk away? I watched Cobre press his forehead against Hector's chest in the October light, and I thought about how some questions answer themselves, not cleanly, not in words, but in the quiet weight of an animal that has crossed a crowded yard to find the only person it has ever organized itself around. And I thought about what that means for the rest of us, about what we owe to the things we put down in the mud, about what it costs to walk away and what it costs not to, about what stays written in the body long after the mind has moved on. I didn't write any of that in the logbook. I just let it be the light on the scrubland and the sound of nothing moving, and the old gray donkey pressed against the man who had come down to him once, in the cold, with nothing much to offer except the choice to stay.